everyone, I'm Jess. Welcome to the Oakley Roots channel. Today's tutorial is a small yet fun one. Today we're making coasters. Coasters? Why? I know it seems kind of basic. Alright, yeah, and I know you can buy adorable coasters at the store. You can buy anything we make at the store, guys. Alright, we don't make them because you can't find it in a store. We make them because we can customize them and we put our heart and soul, which those stores don't put into their products. So when I first started making quilts, I wanted to practice some free motion quilting, but I didn't want to practice on a quilt that took me 6 months to make. So I put together these little charm square coasters. They're just little quilt sandwiches that are 5 inches by 5 inches. And I used those to practice free motion quilting. Now I made a stack of probably 30 of these suckers. I made these honestly to throw away. They were just little quilt sandwiches, but then I was like, well, I want to practice some binding too. So then I added a little binding around them, and then I was like, you know what, I'm just going to kind of flop it on my table and use it as a coaster. These they're cute-ish, but if you look close, like, they're a little ugly. They are everywhere in my house. We use these things all the time, and we have been for 4 years. So I was thinking, you know what, I think it might be time to actually make cute fabric quilted coasters. So that's what we're doing today. We're going to go through a few different options. So if you look on fabric websites, you can buy a lot of pre-cuts. And for newer sewers, these are usually the most fun things to buy. It allows you to get every single pattern in a new fabric line, and it doesn't cost a ton of money considering how many cuts you get. However, they are smaller cuts, and then it's kind of like, what do I do with it? So by far the most affordable pre-cut packaged fabrics are the charm squares. You can see you can get basic colors, you can get fabric lines. Unless you're making some sort of a square basic quilt, sometimes we don't know what to do with these. So these are actually great for the project today. They make the perfect size coasters. So the first coaster we're going to go through is a basic charm square coaster. This is using pre-cuts, or if you have your own fabric, it's just 5-inch by 5-inch cut of fabric, bound together, quilted, done. Super cute. If you have a fabric line that you really want to showcase, this is great for it because you just put it on and you're done. After that, I'm going to show you how to use your Cricut Maker. Yes, this is for all you Cricut Maker users out there, or anybody who's considering a Cricut Maker but you want to see what it can do. I'm going to use my Cricut Maker and I'm going to show you how to make this adorable coaster. Shush, right? Just shush. So this is like the family favorite right now. It's a little Christmas tree. It's very simple, very easy to get through. Really, really handy when you use your Cricut Maker to cut out all the little template pieces. And then I use some just little candy stripe binding on it. We're going to also look into adhering heat transfer vinyl to one of our coasters just to make sure it adheres well to the quilt. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing down below. If at any point you like the video, give it a like. Any questions or comments or shout outs or anything you want to say, put them down in the comment section down below. Let's get started. So for this project, you're going to need 2 charm squares. Now, charm squares are pre-cut pieces of fabric that are 5 inches by 5 inches. You can also just cut your own fabric down to 5 inches by 5 inches. You have a lot of options for types of fabric here. This is just a quilt cotton, and this is a cotton flannel. You're going to also need a scrap piece of batting. Now, we're going to cut off a piece of this batting to 5 inches by 5 inches. And now I have a charm square cut of batting. You're going to also need some binding for this project. Now, I like to use a fat quarter fabric that I really don't see myself using in other projects. If you already have some extra binding like I do right here, you can use that for this project. We don't use a whole lot of binding, just about 39 inches of binding for one charm square coaster. I'm going to walk you through how to cut the binding, make the binding, and how to use my website to help you calculate how much of this you're going to need. I'm going to be using thread today on everything, including the quilting. So if you're using Aurifil, it's the orange ones. I'm going to be using my Microtex 7010 needles for piecing and quilting. To help with quilting, I suggest using some sort of a Hera marker, just some sort of a dull blade to help you mark on your coasters how you want to quilt it. And I'll be using some clover clips to kind of hold it all together. This basic charm square coaster is very simple to piece, to quilt, and to complete, and it doesn't require a whole lot of material. All right, so the first step is just putting together our quilt sandwich. You should have 2 pieces of fabric cut at 5 inches by 5 inches and your batting about 5 inches by 5 inches. Take your bottom piece of your coaster. Now this doesn't have a right side and a wrong side, So you just put it whichever way, but you're going to take your bottom piece and put it face down. Take your batting and put it right above it. And then take your top and line it up over, just like this. Now quilting this is totally up to you. If you have a free motion foot and you want to do some free motion quilting on this, go ahead and do that. I'm going to be showing you how to just do straight line quilting today. To get started, I'm going to use my Hera marker and just a small ruler, and I'm just going to draw one straight line down the middle. Now I'm eyeballing it. I'm not measuring where the middle is. Just like that. All I'm going to be doing today are some simple straight line quilting down the middle of my coaster. The lines that I quilt end up being about 3/8 of an inch apart. That's just because I'm using the side of my presser foot as my guide when I'm quilting. You can determine how big you want your quilting lines using anything you want. For example, right now you could use your Hera marker, and if you wanted to make sure you had 1/2 inch line quilt lines, you just line up your 1/2 inch with your previous marking using your Hera marker, and then just continue on marking your lines, and then all you have to do is follow that along on your machine. But for me, I kind of like to wing it, so I'm just going to do straight lines at the width of my presser foot. So you can use quilting curved pins here to hold this in place if you want. If you don't have those, that's perfectly fine. Just use some clover clips. This is a small piece to quilt, so you don't have to worry about a ton of movement. So the first thing I like to do is adjust my stitch length before I start quilting. Machines typically default to a 2.5 millimeter stitch length. I like a little bit bigger of a stitch. I'm going to increase the stitch length to 3, but that's as far as I'm gonna go. That gives me a nice bigger stitch that looks more like a nice quilting line, but it's not so big that I have to worry about it breaking easily. So I just line up my needle with the top of my line that I marked using my Hera marker, put my foot down, and then just go along straight from the top to the bottom. I don't backstitch at the beginning and the end of these quilt lines because I'm going to be wrapping all these edges and binding. If you feel more comfortable backstitching at the beginning and the end, go ahead and do that. It will make sure that your quilting doesn't come undone by accident. So when I do my quilting, I always start in the middle-ish, and then I work to one side, and then I flip the whole thing and work to the other side. I don't start at one end and then stop and then start at the bottom end and go back and forth like that with my quilting because it does shift and twist your fabric too much. I start at the top, go down, continue, go back to the top, go down, back to the top, go down, like that. And then once I'm done with one side, I'll flip it and I'll do the same for the other side. So now all I'm going to do is I'm going to line up where I just stitched with the edge of my presser foot, and I'm going to use that as my guide. Alright, so now I have that side quilted, so now I'm just going to turn the entire charm square around, and I'm going to do the exact same thing, except now my top is this end, and I'll just continue top to bottom, top to bottom, top to bottom. And that's how I'm going to quilt my charm block. Now let's go back to the table and discuss binding this. So once we review our charm square, you might notice on the back that you have a lot of these little random strings that get caught in the stitching. I am not quite sure of a strategy to prevent this, so I am almost positive that one of you knows what to do to prevent these strings from getting caught in the beginning of the stitch lines. So if any of you guys can comment down below the strategy for this, I'll make sure that I include it in the description of this video and share that information with everybody else. But my technique is just I go through and I use a seam ripper to kind of pull out these little strands that got stuck in the stitching. So now what you can do is just take your ruler and trim everything down to the appropriate size. Like I said, things kind of move around when you're quilting, so you can just kind of clean it up a bit. It'll make binding a tidbit easier. So there we go. Our charm square block is all ready to be bound. Put that to the side for now, and let's discuss our binding. So on my website at www.oakleroots.com, I provide a binding tutorial. So if you click on quilts, binding calculator, and tutorial, you can see a detailed breakdown of the binding steps, as well as a video that helps you. For today, what we're interested in is this binding calculator. So for the binding calculator, you're going to input the height and the width of your quilt in inches. This is a charm square, so like I said, they're 5 inches by 5 inches. Now you can figure out your binding strip width. Traditionally, I use a 2.5 inch binding strip. For today's tutorial, we're going to change this binding strip width to 2.25 inch wide strip. I wouldn't suggest going lower than that because it does get very difficult to work with the binding when it is smaller than that. My binding fabric width is going to tell me how long of a strip I can cut. If you're using a fat quarter like I am, your strips are going to be at the most about 22 inches long. Since we're not cutting on the bias, so I'm going to change this to 22 inches and I'm going to click calculate. So what it tells me is that the entire binding length I need is 39 inches long, which is going to be made up of 2 strips, which are 22 inches long, and I would need about 1/4 yard to do this. So what that means is that if I'm cutting my fat quarter strips at the longest part of the fat quarter, which is 22 inches long, I really only need to cut 2 strips that are 2.25 inch wide each. So that's what I'm going to do today. Take your fat quarter and lay it so that the longest side is vertical. Now the first thing I do with a new fat quarter is I'm going to straighten up this edge. Remove that. Now we're going to cut 2.25 inch long strips. And I'm just going to cut that strip out. All right, so now we have our strips ready to go. So now we're going to build our 2 strips into 1 strip. To do this, lay one of your strips horizontal, take your other strip in a vertical way, and we're just going to line up the corners just like this. They're going to be right sides together, corner to corner, one horizontal, one vertical. Grab a pencil and a ruler. To help with this part, I like to actually lift up my top binding just a little bit so I can see where the edge of the bottom binding is, and then I just mark it with a pencil like that. So now all I'm doing is drawing a line from the top left corner of my top binding to that mark, also on the top binding. Just like this, we're making a nice diagonal. Now you can clip this together. Take this to your sewing machine and just sew right over this marked line. You're going to use a standard 2.5 millimeter stitch length. Just sew from the top to the bottom of this marked line. You do not have to backstitch, but you are always welcome to do that if you feel more comfortable. So I've stitched these 2 together on that marked line. Now we just have to trim off this extra corner. Trim them off at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Just line up your 1/4 inch on your ruler with the stitches and trim. When pressing the binding, I first like to press it just as it is as we sewed it, which is right sides together. And then I open it up and I just kind of finger press along that seam to get everything lined up. So now just put your iron over that open seam, flip it over, and I like to press my seams open so that they don't create bulk when I'm going along attaching it to my quilt or my coaster. So I finger press this open once it's cool, and then I just very carefully put my iron over it, let it set for a second, and there you go. So now we have our binding strip ready to be made. Making binding is very simple. All we're going to do is we're going to fold it right sides together and then carefully apply our iron. And I just kind of leave the iron in one spot while I'm folding the rest of it, just like this. And then I just move it along. And then I'll just continue with this method. All right, now our binding is all ready to go to be put on our coaster. So if you have bound quilts before, you might find my method of doing the binding a little frustrating. This is a very small thing to bind, which means our traditional method of applying the binding, the first round, which is the machine round, doesn't work because we don't have a big space to connect the ends together in the end. So this is my method. If you go slow and carefully, it is not that difficult. It's just different. Take your binding and run it so that the end is over on the top left corner, just like this. Clip that in place. Now, before we go to the sewing machine, we're actually going to miter our corner here, which means we have our binding parallel to the top edge of our coaster. We're going to take our binding and we're going to fold it so that it is perpendicular to the top edge of the coaster. You guys make fun of me for my math terms, but you don't know I have a degree in mathematics. I have a master's in mathematics. So there we go. So now you can see our binding goes from horizontal to vertical with a 45-degree angle. Remember, I'll show you again. We just take it and we flip it up just like that. Now, keeping your finger down on that 45-degree angle, take your binding and fold it straight down, just like that. And then take a clip and clip this corner in place. I like to take a couple of them because we're not actually going to sew this corner until later. I know. So there we go. So now you should have the top strip pinned down and the top right corner pinned in place. We're actually going to start sewing halfway down on the right side. So here we're going to use a 2.5mm stitch length, and we're going to sew 1/4 of an inch from the edge. You're going to start about halfway on the right side. Make sure you backstitch at the beginning here. And then you're going to go all the way down until you're about 1/4 of an inch from the bottom edge. Once you get to there, backstitch and cut off. So now we're going to miter this corner. Just like before, you're going to have your binding strip horizontal, and then you're going to fold it up so that it's vertical. And you have a nice 45-degree angle right here. Use your finger to hold down that corner and fold the whole thing back down, just like that. Now go back to your sewing machine, and we're going to start at the top of this edge, and we're going to backstitch and then go along again until we're about 1/4 of an inch from the bottom edge. And then cut off when you're there. Make sure you backstitch before you cut off. Again, we're going to miter this corner. And this is going to be the last corner we miter before we go back to the table. So back up and down. Now we're going to start at the top of this edge, and we're going to go about halfway down. Once we get to halfway of our coaster, we're going to stop and backstitch. All right, so this is where you should be at. You should have 2 corners stitched down, 1 corner pinned in place, and 1 corner not yet addressed. Let's go back to the table. So here we are. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to miter this corner right here using clips. So lift up the beginning of your binding and just kind of move that to the side. You can even clip it to the side. Now turn your coaster so that your binding is going left to right. And your loose edge is on the right. Fold your binding up just like we've done before with mitered corners so that we have this nice 45-degree angle, and fold it down. There you go. Clip this in place, just like that. Take your strip and just cut it where it runs off the coaster. We're going to trim this down some more, but for now, let's just make it a little bit more manageable. So if you want to make future steps just a bit easier, I suggest pressing down these corners. What we're going to do is actually unclip these corners and then reconstruct them later. But to help the fabric kind of snap back to this, I suggest pressing this down. So unclip one corner and just take your iron and just press. And then lift up. This is going to make putting it back together later a little bit easier. So now move this strip out of the way. Unclip the opposite corner that's just held in place with clips, and press. So just put like 1 clip back on each corner to hold it down. Find the midpoint of your coaster. You can measure to the 2.5 inch mark, or you can just kind of fold them together. Grab a pin and mark the middle of your coaster. What we're going to do is we're going to measure half of the width of the binding from either side of this pin. So our binding is 2 1/4 inches wide. Half of that is 1 1/8. Let's start with the binding that's loose on the left side. Move the other binding out of the way for now. We're going to lay it flat against the top edge. And we're going to measure 1 1/8, which is that first tick after the 1, away. So 1 inch and 1/8 inch. And then mark a line. Now you can cut along that line. There we go. We're going to do the same with the other side. So with the other side, lay it down flat along the top edge. But this time we're going to be marking it on the opposite end of the pin. So you should just try to remember when you're doing your binding should go past the pin. Whichever direction it's heading, it's going to go past the pin. This binding is going this way. It's going to go past the pin that way. If you find yourself cutting your binding before it gets to the pin, you don't do that. All right, so 1/8 after the inch is right there. So I'm going to mark at the end of my ruler, just like that. And now I'm going to cut. Now you can remove your pin and remove all the clips off your corners. Now we actually have to kind of undo what we did. So take your binding and pull them apart just like this. Open the folds of your binding and put your binding right side together. Now we're going to twist the binding so that they come at an angle. When I twist it, I make sure that they're nice and straight. My bindings are nice and straight. I put them right sides together, and then I'm going to twist the right side so that the folded part is going away from me, just like that. So just clip it together as best you can. Move your coaster to the side a little bit so that we can make this nice and flat. And this is why we didn't sew on the corners when we were attaching the binding, because if we did, we wouldn't have enough of the binding left to make a nice flat area right here. So now we just need to make a diagonal from the top corner to the bottom. So just like we did originally, I'm going to find the bottom corner of the bottom binding and just mark that on my top binding so that I know where I'm going. Move your pins around if you have to. Take your ruler, and we're just going to go from corner to mark. Just draw a nice diagonal. It's okay if it's a bit messy. It turns out just fine. So reclip it in place. All right, now go to your sewing machine and just sew along this line. At a 2.5 millimeter stitch length, just sew right along this line. So I have mine sewn on. You can use your small ruler and a rotary cutter to trim down this corner to 1/4 inch seam allowance from the stitch, but I'm just going to eyeball it, and I'm just going to cut about 1/4 inch away from my stitches. There we go. Now we just have to press this open. So we're going to press this open just like we pressed the binding open when we were originally building it. Press it as it is and then open it up. Now it's a little bit harder to press this because it's all together. Don't be afraid to press on top of your coaster. You're not going to hurt your coaster by ironing on top of it. Now open up your seam and press it open. And then just fold it together again. You can kind of pull on the ends. And then if you want, you can just run your iron and repress the middle here. Just where you were working. Try not to press too far on the sides because remember, we still have those press marks from our corners. So here's where we are. So now we need to redo our corners so that we can finish up our binding. So on my binding, I have these lines from where I pressed originally. I can just refold my binding along those and it should snap back pretty easily. If you gave it a good press, this should, I mean, look, I didn't even touch this other corner and it just naturally snapped back to that mitered corner. So I just kind of readjust it. All right, so now we can go to the sewing machine and we can finish sewing the opposite half of our coaster. So you're going to need to find where you ended your stitching. So this is probably going to be on the right side for you, and we're just going to start there. So lower your presser foot. Again, 1/4 inch seam allowance, 2.5 millimeter stitch length. Start along those stitches, and you can give yourself a small back stitch. Now we're going to go along the side, and once we get to this mitered corner, we're actually going to lift up the flap. If you have the flap like this, lift it up and fold it the other way. And just sew until you get close to your crease. And then backstitch. The thing is you don't want to sew the opposite end of your binding. There you go. So now all you have to do is fold back over that edge. Start at the top corner, just like normal. Backstitch. And go along the next edge. And just do the same thing on the next edge. Once you get close, fold back that flap and just go down until you get to close to your crease. You don't have to get right on it, just get close to it. There you go. Fold it back the way it was. Start at the top right corner, backstitch, and just go all the way down to your beginning stitches. And backstitch. And there you go. That's how I attach binding onto a very small quilt or coaster. Now, while we're here, let's discuss attaching the next side of the binding using a sewing machine. So now what we do is we just fold it over and wrap it around that raw edge. You don't need to make this really tight, and then just pin it. So you should have one edge like that. Now, typically I would hand bind this on so that you wouldn't see any of the stitches that are going to be used to attach this on the front side of the quilt. But today I'm going to use my machine to bind it on. So for now, since this is a small little quilt, we want to clip the entire binding on as it needs to be stitched so we can just run our machine along all the edges. To clip the corner, make sure your horizontal edge is nice and straight. And over on the corner, it should be going straight with a 45-degree angle. Keep that nice angle while you fold your right edge inwards. Clip that down. And you can use as many clips as you need. So I just clip the corner down like that, and then I continue on along the other edges. Just clipping it all together. Clipping the entire charm quilt makes it so that you can just kind of speed through the sewing process. All right, so now I have the entire binding clipped down. All I have to do is sew it in place. We're going to sew along the edge at 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. So it's going to be 1/8 of an inch into the binding. And I'm going to be using a standard 2.5 millimeter stitch length. I do like to backstitch at the start and the stop of my binding. I had a few of you suggest I use a stiletto at these corners to help keep the edge in place. I don't have a stiletto, so I'm actually going to use my seam ripper. And what I'm going to do is just very gently hold down that corner while I get close to the edge. And that just makes sure that the needle, that everything stays where it's supposed to be. So once you just cross that folded over edge, turn your fabric, and your 1/8 of an inch mark, which is usually going to be like the inside of your presser foot, should line up with this edge. If it's too far one way or the other, just rotate your charm square and go back or forward as necessary. And then continue on. Once you get to the end, make sure you backstitch. And there you have your basic charm square coaster. So now let's go over a method to make the top of our charm square a pieced top. Now I'm going to show you how to make this adorable tree as a pieced top for your coaster. I'm going to be using the Cricut Maker for this. You can get the SVG for this design on my website at oakleroots.com in the pattern vault. I will also have a PDF walking you through how to piece this using rectangles and squares. For those of you who don't have a Cricut Maker or don't want to use the templates, I will tell you that using the templates from the Cricut Maker is so much easier and quicker than making this using rectangles and squares. It also reduces the fabric waste. So to make this little piece top, you just really need a small amount of fabric. This will be my background. These are just little triangles that kind of remind me of Christmas trees. I'm using this flannel. I think it's a mammoth flannel for the tree. And what I like about that is that this is quilt cotton, and then flannel. So it provides some texture. For the tree, I'm going to be using this green lighted fabric. I will also have a link for the project that's in the Cricut design space in my Facebook page. So make sure you check Oakler Roots on Facebook, and I'll have a link for this there. So once you have it open, just click customize and we can take a look at it. You can see that I have it laid out as it's going to be in the end. So once you're ready to cut, go ahead and click make it into the design space. And what's so cool about the Cricut is that it takes all of your pieces and it lays them out in a way to use the least amount of fabric. Now, when you're using fabric where you don't care about the direction of your print, this is awesome. This reduces waste significantly. But for me, I actually want the background to have a very specific layout, so I'm going to readjust the cuts to make sure I do that. Hold down shift when you're rotating to make sure that it rotates at 45, 90 degree rotations, nothing too wonky. This way, at least I know that the print is going to be going vertical on all of my pieces, so when they piece together, the background is going to look exactly like I like it. So I'm going to need a piece of fabric that's about 7 inches by probably 7.5 inches wide just to be safe. So now I'm going to take one of my Cricut fabric grip mats and remove the plastic. Make sure you hold on to that plastic and keep it covered whenever you're not using it. That will help make the sticky last as long as possible. I'm going to take my fabric and I'm going to lay it out in the direction I want it to go. You can see I did a rough cut of my fabric. Really, I just want to make sure it's within 7 inches and 7 inches, just like that, and that my print is going vertical. All I have to do is load this up. So I'm going to insert it into my Cricut. So what's cool here is that you have to tell it what you're using. So I'm using fabric cotton. I have the right rotary blade already in place. So now I'm going to click the load button, and then all you do is click the cute little Cricut button, and it's going to cut out the fabric perfectly. Alright, once it's all done, it'll tell you to unload it. Now, let's remove the fabric. And you can see it just peels off so nicely. I mean, what? So the one thing I did find was that because I have smaller cuts and some of my fabric, the weave is a little bit loose, is that when I was picking them out with my fingers, sometimes the edges were kind of shredding a little bit. So I'm using one of the Cricut weeding tools, and I just use this to grab a corner and then pull it up, just like that. Because the edges are sticking to the mat, it reduces the fraying. All right, and now we're just going to do the same exact thing with the rest of the cuts. What's so cool, again, about the Cricut design space is that it just moves on to the next thing. You chose which one you want to start with, and now it's going to move you on to the next thing. So for us, it's the green Christmas trees, and we can just hover over the placemat. It'll give you a visual of it. You can always go in and edit it and change the orientation if you have a directional fabric. The rest of the fabric I'm using, I don't care which direction it goes in, so I'm just going to let Cricut design it for me. It shows me that I need a piece of fabric that's about 5 inches by 6 inches to cover the cuts, so I'm just going to go trim that off my fabric and place it down. So you can see when I make these cuts, I make really jagged cuts. I just kind of use my ruler and eyeball the measurements, and then I just kind of, because it doesn't really matter. I don't have to use a rotary cutter to make sure everything is super straight. Cricut is going to do it all for me, which is crazy. All right, so we're just going to load this up like we did previously. Make sure to kind of smooth it out if you have any little ripples. And just like before, pull it up. And there is our little Christmas tree. So cute. All right, so Cricut Maker is going to automatically send us to the next one. Again, I'm just going to kind of hover over and see how big of a piece I need. Just going to place my rectangle at the top, just like that. Now, this is a flannel, and I actually keep it loaded as fabric cotton, and I haven't had a problem with the cutting. It is a bit thicker than the cotton, but it cuts very easily. And you can see on the design space, once it's done, it knows it's done. You just click finish and super easy. It's really impressive, honestly. All right, so now let's piece the block. The first thing I like to do is just kind of lay it out so I can see how it's supposed to look in the end. So let's lay out my trees, lay out my base, and there we go. So what's nice about these templates is that the rounded corners make it very easy to piece together. I like to use pins for piecing together quilt blocks. So let's just start layer by layer. Starting at the top, all we have to do is turn them right sides together, line up this corner with the corner on the tree, and the rounded edge to the top. A little tiny bit of the top of the green triangle should be poking out. There we go, and we're just going to pin those edges together and set to the side. Now let's go to layer number 2. Same thing, right sides together. The rounded edges should line up perfectly. And that's what's nice about the Cricut Maker, is that it does cut them to the exact size you want them. All right, for the third layer, we're just going to line them up. This is just simple rectangles, so side to side and pin in place. Now let's go sew these together. We're going to be using a 1/4 inch seam allowance and a 2.5 millimeter stitch length. So I'm actually going to test out this little mini iron by Cricut. Look, so now it gets all green when it's nice and hot. So when pressing these, just like normal, we press them right sides together first. And then we open it up. And then we're going to press down on this little guy right here. You can press your seams open if you'd like. It will help reduce the bulk because there are quite a few seams here. So this guy gets nice and hot. He's actually pressing really well. I'm pretty impressed. All right, so just do this for the remaining pieces. So now let's just pin and sew on the remaining edges just like we did with the right side. Alright, so now I'm going to sew these on the same exact way I sewed on the right side at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, 2.5 millimeter stitch length, and I'll be right back. So now all we have to do is piece together each row and you're done with your coaster quilt top. This is a very fun, cute project to make. Alright, so now we're going to sew along this edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance with a 2.5 millimeter stitch length. Go ahead and press your seam. And I don't press all of my seams open. If they're laying flat, then I don't worry about it. Now we're going to do the same thing. Pin the bottom on. Right sides together. And sew again using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, 2.5 millimeter stitch length. And there you have your adorable little tree block for your coaster. So for our last project experiment, let's see how well some Cricut iron-on transfer adhesive works on these little quilted coasters. What I want to do is I want to cut out a design from this that was free on the Cricut Studio, and I'm going to adhere it onto my quilted coaster to see how well it sticks. So here is my super cute cutout, which did not take long at all. And I am just going to kind of, I think I'm going to off-center it a bit because I like that. So I don't think that this tiny iron is meant to do this, but we're just going to do it. We're just going to push it down and let it sit for a few seconds. So I'm just pushing it down for like 20 seconds in each spot. Obviously a bigger iron is going to take less time, but since I already had this little guy out, I kind of want to see if he can handle it. I have a feeling this little buddy can do it. He's so adorable. No way. That's so cute. All right, let me let it cool for a second and then we'll see how well it adhered to the quilting. All right, so looking at this, I think it adhered really well to the quilting. I don't see it lifting anywhere. So if you were interested in this heat transfer vinyl on your coasters, I say go for it. So there we go. What? So these are super cute coasters that are very simple to make, especially if you're using charm squares. The binding can be a tiny bit tricky, but once you use my method, I'm telling you, it's not that hard. It's not hard, it's just different. But this is the basic one, charm square, heat transfer vinyl. It's so cute. I mean, I love this. And then here we pieced a little Christmas tree so that we can make maybe some more festive holiday coasters. You can go super basic, you can go super cute. Like I said, all of the files, the PDF and the SVG file to make the Christmas tree coaster will be on my website at oaklyroots.com in the pattern vault. So I know these kind of look like nunchucks right now. That's just because of the fabric I chose. They're a very cute snowflake design using the proper fabric. If you're interested in the SVG and possibly a PDF for these coaster quilt tops, leave me a comment down below and I will get one whipped up and put it up on the site for you. So if you haven't already subscribed, please click the subscribe link down below. If you're interested in seeing more videos, we do a lot of sewing videos. We do a lot of crafty videos. If you like this video, make sure you give it a like. If you want to shoot me an email, I'm jessica@oaklyroots.com. You can check me out on all my other social media pages. I'm on Facebook and Instagram and Pinterest. I hope you have a great day and a great week. Get out there and make something. Bye!